Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Mr. Windsor speaking. Welcome to another edition of Year 7 History, looking at the New World and the various kind of fascinating cultures we were able to find there. Unfortunately, a bit of a pattern emerging. They ultimately will fall victim to European settlers. Not too much of a spoiler alert there. Let's see if we can crack on with today's lesson. Now, last lesson we spoke about the Maya and the Aztecs, and the lesson before that we spoke about Christopher Columbus in 1492 landing in the New World, setting the stage for all loads of new other countries to come over to the Americas and start settling in the name of their own countries, such as Spain, France, Britain, and Holland as well. So before we go on to that, I'd like to do a bit of a recap. I have a bunch of statements on the screen. What I'd like you to do is to create 3 columns, please. One of them will say Aztec, the other one will say Maya, and one in the middle will say both. What I'd like you to do, please, ladies and gents, is to put these statements into the correct column. If you think it applies to only the Aztecs, put it in the Aztec column. Only the Maya, put it in the Maya column. Or if you think it refers to both cultures, put it in the both column, please, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so we'll check over that in a minute just to get your brain warmed up. Have a crack at that task for me. Okay, so let's see then. So we're going to have Maya on the left, Aztecs on the right, and both in the middle. Okay, so the way I see it looks a bit like this. So first of all, the Maya were divided into various different city-states. So they weren't one kingdom. They were little sort of gathered around their main cities. Another key thing, they live predominantly in forest and jungle. People are still pretty mystified as to how they built these enormous cities in the jungle, but it's something that they were clever enough to achieve. They were more seafaring, so the Maya had a lot more coastal land, and so it seemed to fit. It was sensible to them to build some boats and get out there and begin trading with people who lived across the water. And also, they had a focus on astrology. So, a famous example of this is the Maya calendar, which supposedly predicted the end of the world in 2012. Both had step pyramids. Had strict levels to societies. They each had a hierarchy with the king or emperor at the top, nobles and priests further down, and the peasants and normal working people at the bottom. So they both worshipped many gods, or in other words, they were polytheistic. Both of them are known to have engaged in human sacrifice. Okay, Aztecs only now. The landscape they occupied was drier and flatter. It was also mainly inland because they weren't as seafaring as the Maya were. They were more inland and so were more land-based. They were one united kingdom. Wherever you went across Aztec lands, they'd all say that they're part of the Aztec nation. They used aqueducts to bring running water to the city from far away, a hugely complex series of aqueducts and pipes that brought water from far away so they could use running water in their city. Okay, so before we go on to speaking about the Native Americans, I just want to give you a little bit more background on the Aztec and the Maya. It'd be a shame to leave their story where we left it. I want to be able to tell you what happened when Europeans began to flock to the Americas after Christopher Columbus in 1492. So in 1492, despite some contentious evidence that Northern Europeans made the journey across the Atlantic, Columbus is accepted as the first European to land in the New World in the Bahamas. It is said that around the year 1000 AD, Icelandic explorers landed in North America in a place called Newfoundland, which is in Canada. So their literature speaks of that. However, that evidence isn't set in stone. We don't know that for certain. And so we say that Christopher Columbus was the first known and accepted European explorer. After Columbus, European explorers came thick and fast to the New World. The Spanish and Portuguese made expeditions in the south, while English, Dutch, and others made inroads in the north. So in North America, what you consider the modern USA would be kind of the English and the Dutch and the French as well, whereas down towards Mexico would be Spanish and the Portuguese, and hence why Mexico is still Spanish-speaking, and further south, Brazil is still Portuguese-speaking. The main problem was that in the New World, they had discovered was not new at all, but they had been inhabited for thousands of years by a diverse range of indigenous native peoples. So Christopher Columbus landed in 1492, but by 1518, people were flocking to the New World with varying different results. Hernan Cortez, a Spanish man, led an expedition of conquest to the eastern coast of Mexico through Mayan territory and towards the Aztec Empire. In November, Moctezuma II, leader of the Aztec Empire, met Cortes, unsure about how she'd deal with a small Spanish force of only 530 soldiers. What we see up on the top right here, this is artist's interpretation, of Montezuma. We know that Aztec kings had to be very good in battle, and we see him here with his spiked club against the metal-armored Spanish conquistadors, while Montezuma himself is not wearing any metal armor. You could say that the Spanish's weaponry was far more advanced. They had steel swords versus kind of clubs and mallets used by the Aztecs. That's not to say that the Spanish were more civilized than the Aztecs, just they were in many ways better equipped. Montezuma was as sure of himself as the Spanish, and when his advisors asked what was to be done about Cortes, he responded, "Are we not the masters of the world?" This gives us an interesting idea, actually, because in the Aztec view, they were the masters of the world because they'd never come into contact with anyone outside of their world. And so, to their mind, they're the only people that existed. And so the Spanish took on the role as the ferocious invader to the Aztec, in the Aztec mind. By 1520, Cortes had seized control of the Aztec Empire, massacring women and children, plundering the Aztec treasure houses, and burning great portions of the city. Unfortunately, this is a bit of a pattern when it comes to European settlers, especially if the native people refused to convert to Christianity. They were often exterminated without mercy, and their resources taken, and their women and children murdered as well. The Spanish had been aided by a familiar ally in their conquest, smallpox, which is a disease that they brought over with them from Europe. Because the inhabitants of the Americas didn't have immunity to this disease, it wiped out a large proportion of the native people as well. So the native people that didn't die by Spanish hands died due to this illness. One of the things that Cortes wanted to do with some of the enslaved Aztecs is he wanted to put them to work building Mexico City and also dredging the rivers for gold. Some of them, if the stories go, some of the Aztecs preferred to take their lives rather than do what Cortes had told them as slaves. And what we're seeing in the bottom right, you might remember this from a couple of lessons ago, what we're seeing here is the ones who resisted Cortes superheated the gold that the Spanish craved, held down some of their prisoners, and poured the molten gold into their throats. And so that was a fitting revenge in their mind for Spanish greed and Spanish barbarism in killing thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of their people. There's also this chap. Pedro del Alvarado was sent south to colonize Mesoamerica, so the area in which the Maya lived. Aiding in the Spanish conquest was the introduction of European diseases which decimated Mayan populations since they had no immunity. So not only were the Spanish there to kill the Mayans who didn't want to change religion, also European diseases killed them as well. The primary goal of conquistadors, the conquerors in Spanish, within the Americas was to locate vast quantities of gold and silver. Trace amounts of these precious metals were found that had been transported to the Mayan kingdom via their various trade routes from Colombia and Ecuador, but the Spanish did not find the riches they were hoping for. The Spanish colonization entailed forced labor and mandatory conversion to Christianity, so they enslaved them and wanted them to convert to Christianity. The Maya who refused to give up their own religious practices, their own rich culture, their way of life that they'd been practicing for thousands of years, they were arrested and some of them were tortured to death for not worshipping the Christian God. It took the Spanish probably about 170 years to conquer Mayan territory, which is, they put up a bit of a fight. But 170 years later, this is what we might now call Mexico and the other Spanish-speaking countries to the south of North America. So there is a bit of a pattern emerging here of Europeans behaving in a particularly barbaric way to people who had already lived in the territory that they desired. They saw them as less civilized, and therefore that in their minds meant that they could exterminate them without mercy and without guilt. Okay, so on that cheery note, let's go on to the topic of today's lesson. So we're going to talk about the Native American population. So we're going to give an understanding of native peoples in the Americas in something called the pre-Columbian era. We're going to compare and contrast the civilizations covered to find any consistent patterns between the Aztec, the Maya, and the Native Americans. Okay, so let's put this into a sort of a geographic context. So here's Europe. A lot of these, Columbus would have sailed from Spain, as did Hernan Cortes and de Alvarado as well. They would have come across here Columbus would have landed in this area here, the Bahamas, whereas Cortez would have landed around here, where he set about exterminating the Aztecs. A little bit further south, so in southeast Mexico, down this little bit in Central America, this is where de Alvarado would have been set to work colonizing the Mayan area. The word colonizing is kind of a bit of a misnomer, really. What it is code for taking over territory and often treating very, very poorly the native people who lived in that area. So the Spanish in particular set about colonizing Mexico and Central America here. However, further north, what we would consider the modern United States, European countries such as the Dutch, the English, and the French started to make inroads, landing on the East Coast and pushing westwards. New York, actually, on the Dutch theme, New York was actually originally named New Amsterdam, which is one of the main cities in Holland. When it had a name changed to New York a bit later on. So it goes to show how prominent they were in the early colonization of the United States. Okay, so let's recap on stuff that we already know, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so let's recap quiz on the last 3 or so lessons. This should be in your booklet. If not, let's write down the answers on a spare sheet of paper. We've got 5 questions for this recap quiz. What year was Charles II restored to the English throne? Who are the indigenous people of a country? What civilization created a famous calendar? What civilization called themselves people of the sun? Which famous explorer claimed to have found a new world in America? Have a quick go at that. Only a couple of words per answer. Okay, so Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660 after the reign of Cromwell. The public largely were very happy about this because he re-implemented things that were fun. So the pub, for instance, which is particularly apt because now at this point the pubs have been reopened in Britain. Theatres aren't open in Britain, but they were open back then. Gambling rather was re-legalized under Charles I. They're all very, very happy. Indigenous people of the country are the people who live there, so the native people. The famous calendar was made by the Maya. People of the sun were called the Aztecs. And Cristoforo Colombo, his actual name because he was Italian, or if you prefer, Christopher Columbus. Okay, so this is around the time of the 1500s. This is kind of an idea of where the various Native American peoples lived. We have loads of different landscapes, and so in response to those landscapes, the Native Americans, I'm going to try not to call them Indians because that's a false name, because that's based on the idea that they landed in India. They're Native Americans. And the landscape impacted on the lifestyle of the various tribes of Native Americans. So, for instance, many of these societies were nomadic because if you lived in this area, these are called the Great Plains. They were vast open expanses of land that were very difficult to live on in the winter. And so people would migrate to winter pastures in order to survive. So, for instance, the Sioux people here, this is the main tribe we're going to be looking at today. But of course, there are many other Native American tribes, all with their own unique cultural standpoint, religion, way of life, beliefs, an incredibly rich tapestry of culture in Native America. But we're going to be focusing mainly on the Sioux in today's lesson. Okay, so a few things about the Sioux. So they believe this is one of their core beliefs. This is the idea that everything is sort of intertwined. This is called the Native American loop. They believe that everything went cyclically in a cycle. So life, death, the seasons. And we see here, so winter, elder, experience, adolescence, being a teenager, childhood, adulthood. So these things were all interlinked with each other. Sun rises in the east, sets in the west, all that sort of thing. Life goes in cycles. You're born, you get older, you become an adult, you wither, you become old, and then you die, and you return back to the earth. Native Americans, generally speaking, formed tribes made up of their family and their extended family. These tribes could be extended further by intermarrying between different tribes to create alliances between various different tribes that lived nearby. In terms of gender roles, they had what you might call the stereotypical gender roles. The men, in particular, were in charge of hunting and that sort of thing, warfare, and the women were in charge of the running of the house. However, both men and women had an equal say in the politics of the tribe. So they were fairly equal in that regard, although each gender had their own specific roles. Okay, so let's get some more information. So the Indian nation, it was not only the central and southern parts of America that European explorers found new native populations and lands, but also in North America. Native peoples existed pretty much everywhere where the Europeans landed. When white people first arrived on the shores, there were hundreds of different tribes across North America. Each had their own culture and traditions, meaning there is no single way or no single Native American way of life. So everyone had their own, as I said before, had their own culture, beliefs, way of life, that sort of stuff. We're going to focus on one tribe in particular. They're called the Sioux, and they lived on the Great Plains of America. The Sioux were nomadic, meaning they moved around all the time instead of building cities. But if you're moving around all the time, you need a special type of house called a teepee, which are what the Native Americans used as homes. They were made of buffalo leather using very little wood. It meant that they could be set up and taken down very, very quickly on the move. The conical shape meant that it could resist strong winds, and they were quick and easy to pack up. Okay, so that is on the right hand side. This is an interpretation of what a teepee might look like. It's cut off a little bit, but it was in a cone shape and it was very easy to pack up and go as well. So quick checkpoint: what were the Great Plains? Where were the Great Plains rather? What native tribe lived there? What does nomadic mean? What were the teepees made out of and used for? Okay, so the Great Plains were the central part of America here, large open expanse of flat land. If we look back at this picture here, we have mountain ranges in the west, so the Cascades and the Sierra Nevada mountains, Rocky Mountains right in the middle, and Appalachian Mountains on the eastern seaboard. Around middle America, around this area, you've got a large flat plain just before you reach the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. And this is where the Sioux people will have lived, along with others, such as the Arapaho, the Lakota, and the Cheyenne. So native tribe lived there, let's say the Sioux, but the Arapaho, the Lakota, and other tribes as well. Nomadic means that they will move around. This often depended on the seasons. So for instance, in the summer, things tend to grow a lot better. And so they'd be able to stay on the Great Plains in the summer because big herds of animals such as deer would have come to the Great Plains in order to graze, meaning food would be plenty. However, when the winter rolls around, conditions get a bit more harsh, it becomes a bit more difficult to find food, and therefore you need to move places, move location. So the teepees are made out of buffalo skin, American bison skin. They're set up in a conical shape with a few sticks of wood, but the idea is that they are very easy to set up and to disassemble as well. Okay, so a very famous Native American that is in our popular culture and our cultural thought as well is Pocahontas from the Disney film Pocahontas. She has this fantastic song called The Colors of the Wind, and on the left are some of the lyrics from the Disney movie. You think that I'm an ignorant savage and you've been so many places. I guess it must be so, but still I cannot see if the savage one is me. How can there be so much that you don't know? You don't know. You think you own whatever land you land on. The earth is just a dead thing you can claim. But I know every rock and tree and creature has a life, has a spirit, has a name. A couple of tasks I'd like you to do with this. Task 1. What do the lyrics reveal about the way European settlers viewed the Native Americans? Collect quotes from the verse of the song and explain your point. So I've given you some sentence starters down there as well, perhaps a paragraph, few lines, paragraph or so. Task 2. What do the lyrics of the song suggest about Sioux beliefs? So you can use any piece of information, any pieces of information from this lesson so far. You can rewind this video and find out a few things from my explanation stage. But again, I'd like you to use lyrics to back up what you have said there, please. So I suppose the most striking line of this song is this first line of the verse here. You think I'm an ignorant savage. Unfortunately, this was a bit of a pattern with European settlers. They believed that anyone who was there when they arrived was uncivilized, barbaric, savage, any of these negative adjectives you can use to describe a set of people. However, they didn't recognize that each of these native populations had their own set of beliefs and way of life that had been developing for thousands of years before their arrival. criticism would be based on the fact that they weren't Christian. And so in the name of their Christian God, they would often exterminate or torture people if they didn't convert to Christianity. So another thing is here, but I cannot see if the savage one is me. So Pocahontas here is quite rightly using these lyrics to show that actually perhaps it's the European settlers who are the savages, the way they're treating these indigenous peoples, the way Hernan Cortez treated the Aztecs, the way De Alvarado treated the Mayans. They brought over these diseases with them as well that wiped out vast majority of the native peoples. You think you own whatever land you land on. Again, another key thing. These European settlers thought they could come over and just stake their claim on any land, regardless of who was living on it or who was using it at the time. Now, a key thing about the Native Americans is they had a different concept of ownership than we do. They believed that that they borrowed the land that they were hunting and living on from land spirits. And it was the same to an extent with the Maya and Aztec. They didn't believe that they owned the land. They believed that they were borrowing it and they would give it back once they were done. And once they died, once the Native Americans and native populations died, they would return back to the earth that had provided these resources for them. And so they never thought that they actually owned the land. However, Europeans believed that they could buy and sell land and do whatever they want with it. Okay, so what do the lyrics of the song suggest about Sioux beliefs? So the earth is just a thing you can claim, but I know every rock and tree and creature has a life, has a spirit, has a name. So the Sioux Indians, and to an extent other native populations as well, believe that the land and creatures each had a spirit. And so the Native Americans would often, for example, if they were going out to hunt buffalo or bison that day, they'd pray to the bison spirits to aid them in their quest to hunt a bison for food. And so they respected nature a lot more than European settlers did. And so this is where they're in common with the Aztecs and the Mayas, that they live very closely with the land. They're very naturalistic, and so they respected the environment and the atmosphere around them a lot more than the European settlers did. So a key aspect of Native American life was their sort of codependence, I suppose, on the American buffalo. Because there's not a great deal of resources on the Great Plains, what they did notice, however, is that there are herds and herds of buffalo, or in other words, an American bison. And so the native Sioux Indians in particular, and other Plains Indians, worked in cooperation with the bison, and so the bison would provide food and resources for the Native Americans, while the Native Americans would provide protection for the bison. Now, a key thing here is that because the Native Americans were so in tune with nature, they only ever hunted and killed what they happened to need at that time. Whereas the European and quote unquote developed world way of viewing things is that you hunt something to extinction if you think it's tasty enough. So they were very, very careful not to hunt too many of these bison because their relationship with this animal was, in many ways, you could consider it sacred because it provided everything that they needed for their daily lives. They would use every part of the bison, they'd honor every part of the bison so that nothing ever went to waste, and they'd only ever hunt as much as they happened to need. So a bit more info about the buffalo then. There was very little wood on the Great Plains, so natives used the buffalo for almost all of their resources. The Native Americans would eat them, even their brains, nothing can go to waste. Use their bones as weapons, they sharpen their bones into weapons such as knives and arrows. Boil their bones to make glue. Horns would be made into weapons. Buffalo skin would be worn by the Native Americans and to make their teeth and their water bags because they were waterproof. Buffalo hoofs would be made into cups to drink out of. They would make the buffalo's tongue into a hair bunch. Buffalo fat would be made into cooking oil and soap, and the buffalo tail would be used as a fly swat. So they used every single part of the animal, and also a key thing that motivated their nomadic lifestyle of moving around all the time would be the migration patterns of the buffalo. So they would graze on the Great Plains in the summer, and when winter rolled around, the buffalo would move to their winter grazing pastures, and the Native Americans who depended on them would move with them. So let's go on to the next task. So you had some information there. I'd like you to write up this quick diagram as to what each part of the bison would be used for. Again, acknowledging that the Native Americans would not waste any parts of this amazing creature because they understood that nature had given them this creature, and so it was a gift not to be wasted. So, for a challenge, explain how the Native Americans' relationship with the buffalo was more than just hunter and prey. So, this extended beyond just being a hunter and prey relationship. You could say that they were dependent upon each other, and I want you to explain to me how. This is a pretty recurrent theme with native indigenous peoples that lived so closely in harmony with nature, is that they loathed the idea of anything that nature gave them going to waste. And so nothing is more evident than in the way the Native Americans treated buffalo. We heard that every part of them would be used. Their hooves would be changed into cups. Their tongue would have a certain use as well. Their brains could be food. Their horns could be made into weapons. Their skin and their hide could be turned into clothing and tents. Their tail could be turned into a fly swatter. And of course, all the meaty parts would be taken to feed the tribe. Now, the relationship between the Native Americans and the buffalo was what you might call a symbiotic relationship. Both the buffalo and the man gain from this relationship. So the man, the Native Americans in particular, they would gain food and all of these resources that they could take from the buffalo's body. They believed that nature and their deities and their spirits had given them these creatures to live off, and so they treated them with the utmost respect, only killing one every so often when they were needed. The buffalo, in return, would gain protection from predators, or basically just be protected in general to make sure that their numbers didn't go down so badly. Because if their numbers decreased too much, then that means that the Native Americans would be running out of their most important and precious resource. So they revered and respected, and maybe in some ways, maybe even worshipped these creatures just because of how useful they were and how their spirits, how they believe their spirits had given them these natural resources to use. Also, as with the Aztecs and the Maya, the Native Americans had their own set of cultures and beliefs. The Native Americans centered mostly around a practice called shamanism, which is getting in contact with spirits, natural land spirits that lived around. So they believed that each natural entity had its spirit. So a forest spirit, a land spirit, a buffalo spirit. Every creature had its own spirit. And so they prayed to these spirits for their aid and their help. So if they were going out to hunt a buffalo, they would pray to the buffalo spirit to provide them with the buffalo that they needed. With the reality of Sioux religious beliefs, the Sioux had the belief that everything was alive and had spirits, including the land itself. They believed in the power of circles, the idea that everything worked in a cycle like the seasons, the world, and the cycle of life. Like what I showed you at the beginning, the Native American loop, that everything was intertwined with each other, everything is connected. How did they actually practice this religion? So in Sauce was showing a Native American religious practice called the sun dance. So they had an emphasis on the sun. They also had a rain dance as well, drawing a parallel between the Native Americans and the Aztecs, the people of the sun, who revered the sun god above all others. One native would have his chest pierced by wood, then tied to the roof or a tall pole. Others would dance around him until he had a vision from the spirits. This was the way the Sioux would seek advice from the spirit world. So they prayed to their spirits for advice and for help. And this is the way they believed they got in contact with them. Often, each tribe of Native Americans would have their own shaman, which in many ways, I suppose, could be considered as a priest who was in charge of getting in touch with the spirits and asking for their advice. So let's recap on some key points before we get into the end part of today's lesson. So Native American peoples, they had a symbiotic relationship with the American bison. They believe they were given this bison by nature gods and nature spirits, and so they revered and respected and in many ways even worshipped this creature, using every part of it for a useful resource and leaving nothing to waste. Their migration patterns, their nomadic migration patterns were affected by where the bison went in summer and winter. They believed in cycles. Everything was in a cycle. Life, death, nature, spirits, the seasons, everything went in a circle and everything was intertwined. They lived in conical-shaped tents called teepees that were made out of bison hide and skin and a few pieces of wood, because wood was quite scarce on the Great Plains. This meant that they could set up and take down their tents quite easily before moving on to the next place, because they were nomadic and used horses to carry a lot of their equipment. In some cases, they may even have domesticated some bison in order to carry some of their equipment. And of course, they were nomadic, going from place to place, conforming to the cycle of the seasons and also the migration patterns of their bison. However, I'm sure you can spot a recurring theme so far with the Aztecs and the Mayans and European settlers, and unfortunately the Native Americans weren't necessarily able to escape that same cycle of oppression implemented by European settlers. So the Aztecs fell victim to Cortez and his conquistadors, his conquerors, and the Mayans eventually to a chap called De Alvarado. Each civilization was treated very, very poorly, often enslaved or exterminated by European diseases. So further north in what we might call the modern United States of America, the countries mostly jostling for land were England, France, Spain, and Holland. And many of these tribes of Indians were drawn into the conflict between these countries. Often these countries would sort of pay money to the Native Americans to obstruct the other countries' progress in the USA. This confusion allowed the Europeans to begin the process of reducing the influence of various tribes, and for others began the slow process of having their lands stripped from them. The white Europeans were very, very good at exploiting the native peoples and taking their land in very tricky ways. So, for instance, in 1737, the colony of Pennsylvania sought to buy land from the Delawares. The Delawares were a group of Native Americans living in the north of the USA. In a so-called walking purchase, where the Native Americans agreed to give land equivalent of a distance to the distance a man could walk in a day. However, the white European settlers made a trick. They employed special runners who were able to run for 60 miles in a day. And so they said, well, my man has run this 60 miles, you know the deal, I want that 60 miles of land. And so they had to give up huge expanses of their land to European settlers. So Native Americans have got a bit of a raw deal since the colonization of the USA. Similar to the Mayans and the Aztecs, they have been treated very, very poorly by Europeans who settled there. And this actually is relevant to us today, because this story of oppression by the now American people has come up in recent news. For instance, the Washington Redskins. For a while, it was pretty contentious, but actually, it was then ruled as the Washington Redskins, named after the Native Americans, was actually racist because it drew attention to the color of the Native American skin. And so now the Washington Redskins are having to review their team name and perhaps even change it due to the offense caused by the Native Americans. I think that's fair enough, since the Native Americans were there before America even became a country and had their land ceded from them, and so to add insult to injury that these people are still using what are essentially racist slurs against them. Another key thing, this happened very, very recently, 25th of June of this year, the Native Americans to protest against the Trump visit to Mount Rushmore. The reason why they have such a problem with this is because Mount Rushmore was actually built on Sioux land, and Mount Rushmore is pretty much like a statement of ownership from America. And the fact that this is built on their ancestral land is an insult to the fact that they've had their land stripped away from them over the course of many years. So even today, Native American populations still have had their land stripped from them. So on this one, so before the European settlers came along, the Native Americans didn't necessarily own the land, but they lived on huge expanses of land, and so they could go wherever they want, whenever they wanted. This changed very quickly after the Europeans made their way to the USA. You can imagine this whole expanse of land would have been land that they could use. However, what we see today, these red spots are the pieces of land that still belong to the Native Americans. Vast tribes of Native Americans are hemmed in on these pieces of land that they have said are theirs. When you consider the amount of land that previously belonged to Native Americans, this is nothing short of an absolute insult. What we see over here is Native Americans meeting with Europeans. What Europeans did early on is they introduced alcohol to the Native Americans. And this is what we see here. We see a barrel of alcohol here and some trades going on in furs and sort of resources in exchange for that alcohol. To this day, not only are Native Americans hemmed in on tiny pieces of land, but there is a disproportionate amount of alcoholism in Native American communities as there are to white communities. This goes back to when the Europeans introduced alcohol to the Native Americans, and so alcoholism is pretty much, you can consider it as an evil brought by Europeans. So all around nastiness, really. Sorry, I realise this is taking a bit of a negative turn, but I think as a history teacher, it's my job to give you the full picture rather than, oh, Europeans came along and they colonised and put cities in the USA. No, I think it's worthwhile us getting the full picture. Yes, the USA was eventually colonised, but at what cost to the native people? Another key thing, and this one I found very, very shocking, we know about the relationship between the Native Americans and the most beloved resource, the bison, the American buffalo, which they made an effort not to take too many of. They only took what they needed. However, when European settlers arrived to the United States, this next slide is what happened. What you're seeing, these European settlers standing on are the skulls of hundreds of thousands of American bison. There isn't really any American bison left. They've been hunted to extinction, not by the Native Americans because they respected nature, but more about the migrants who came from Europe to settle in America. There are now no longer any American bison left because of these settlers. Okay, so I think it's worthwhile us getting the full picture of this. I think when we get a more leveled worldview, we can appreciate the fact that these cultures exist and the fact that these cultures have been oppressed over very, very many years. So let's lead into the final task of today's lesson. Now we've got a full picture of the history, and it's not been whitewashed by saying Europeans are wonderful and they take goodness wherever they go. That is simply not the case. So this is the final task of the lesson. So this is in your booklets, and similar to the Pocahontas song that we worked on earlier on in the lesson, I'd be eager to see if you could create your own song about the Sioux Native Americans or just Native Americans generally. You could talk about their way of life, their religion, their cultural practices, or you could talk about, I'd love to see some sort of song coming about that talks about their land being taken off them by European settlers, the fact that their beloved bison were hunted to extinction. You can make this a ballad, which is a type of slow song, or even make it as a rap. But I'd like loads of information about the Sioux tribe or the Native Americans generally. Task 2 down here. So what we have here is a three-way Venn diagram, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is to consider the similarities and differences between the culture of the Sioux tribe, the Native Americans, the Aztecs, and the Maya. If it's a similarity, then it needs to be put on the areas that overlap. So, for instance, if you have a detail that is that applies to both the Sioux tribe and the Aztecs, you'd write it in this gap here. If you have a similarity between the Sioux tribe and the Maya, you'd write it in here. The Aztec and the Maya, you'd write it in here. We've got loads of things we could put in these two so far. If it's something that all three cultures have in common, then you need to write that thing in the part where all three circles overlap. Okay, so for instance, in the middle of all three circles, because this applies to all three cultures, that all three cultures had a very naturalistic existence, that they worked in harmony with nature and the land that they lived on. The Native Americans certainly did, so did the Aztecs, and so did the Maya. So they all respected nature is something we might be able to put in this middle one. Okay, so that is the final task of today's lesson. I'm going to leave you to work on that independently. I hope I've given you a lot to think about today. The idea that colonizing an area or exploring a new world and claiming it for your country sounds like a good thing from the outset. But if you consider the implications of the people who live on that land, then we can think again about the way those people are treated. Yes, a bit doom and gloom in places, but it's worthwhile us getting this rounded representation of history rather than just always looking at it from the European angle. Thank you very much for listening and participating in my lesson, ladies and gentlemen. I have been Mr. Windsor. I will catch you next lesson. Thank you very much.